Okay, so the ultimate goal of the endocrine system is to maintain homeostasis, but it works together with the nervous system. So really the two systems that keep the body in balance, all body systems, is the endocrine system and the nervous system. Now, what is the difference between an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland? Basically, the endocrine system secretes hormones directly into the bloodstream. And then the hormones have to travel to a target. And so there are receptors for the specific hormones in certain body systems. Like, for example, when I talk about erythropoietin, which is a hormone made by the kidney, but its target, when it's released in the bloodstream, its target is the bone marrow, and it initiates red blood cell production. So I've kind of done that in lecture. I've said, this is, when the endocrine system, which is made up of endocrine organs, and some hormones are made by non-endocrine organs. The kidney is not an endocrine organ, but it does produce a hormone. And it sends a message. And that message is to tell the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. So the target, so you have to understand where is the target, and it's secreted in the blood. Now, there are exocrine glands, and the exocrine glands have to secrete their substances through a duct. And a duct is a tube. And so exocrine glands typically secrete their substances on an epithelial surface locally. And endocrine glands secrete their substances or hormones systemically through the blood. It says, how does the endocrine system respond to achieve homeostasis versus the nervous system? So the endocrine system typically, when it achieves homeostasis, it uses a chemical messenger called a hormone, and that is released in the blood. So it doesn't achieve its effect immediately, but it does last longer. Now, the nervous system uses a chemical messenger, which is a neurotransmitter. Now, those effects are pretty instant, so it's a quick reaction, but the effects don't last as long. Like if you think about, if I touch a hot stove, the nerves are designed to cause that release, and their effects are right at the muscles. And I pull my hand back, but I don't sit here and keep my hand like this forever. It's very quick. Once the painful or the noxious stimulus is gone, my arm goes back to normal. But a hormone is going to have a more sustained effect. Nervous system is quick to react, but doesn't last as long. So again, you have to understand how both systems send their messages. When do the effects kick in? How long do they last? What is a hormone? How does it exert its effect on a cell? Does that have an effect on every cell? Why or why not? So a hormone is literally a chemical messenger. It's a chemical, and it's sending a message. Now, how does it get the message? Again, it goes through the blood. Why does it not have its effect on every cell in the body? Because every hormone has a specific receptor at a target tissue. Now, something like thyroid hormone is working with metabolism. And so those effects are a little more systemic. But thyroid hormones have thyroid receptors in certain areas. So again, a hormone is a chemical messenger, and it has to have a receptor at a target cell. And that's why it does. Not every hormone is going to work at every area. They have to have a specific receptor at a specific target to cause a specific effect. What is meant by negative feedback and positive feedback? How does the body know to provide positive or negative feedback? Okay, basically, hormones are constantly circulating through our blood. Now, hormones are stored in the endocrine organs, but there are hormones that are in the blood. But what basically happens is the hypothalamus is monitoring homeostasis. It's monitoring body temperature, metabolic rate, oxygen status, all kinds of things. And basically, when the body detects falling levels of a hormone, it's going to initiate what's called the positive feedback system. And then what happens is that hormone basically a releasing factor is going to be sent, and it's going to cause that hormone to be released in the blood. Now, the body, once it detects that that hormone level has increased in the blood, it's going to initiate, the negative feedback system, and that basically turns off the release of that hormone once we've achieved adequate hormone levels. Now, if you guys remember, I talked about like your thermostat, so I came home and from being at school, and I forgot our thermostat always turns down because normally we're not home during the day, and my house is like 65 degrees, and I'm like, oh no. So I turned up my thermostat. I said, I want to be 71 degrees. I like it warm. But basically, I heard my heat kick on, okay? Positive feedback. It positively is adding heat to my house. Once the thermostat detects the house is at 71 degrees, it shut off the heat, which is like negative feedback. It's like stop releasing heat, or my temperature would just keep going up and up and up. So again, positive and negative feedback is, Morgan, you're fine. Just if you have to step out, this is being recorded, so no worries. But so basically, things are being monitored. Various things throughout the body are being monitored, but basically positive feedback is initiated when hormone levels fall in the blood, and negative feedback is initiated when hormone levels rise. So we keep a normal level of hormone. Where is the hypothalamus, and what does it have to do with the pituitary gland? So the hypothalamus is part of the diencephalon, which is under the cerebrum, so a small area. Within the diencephalon is the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus basically controls the pituitary gland. It'll tell the pituitary gland to either release hormones or, stop releasing hormones, and it basically controls that activity. Number 8, what is the pituitary gland and what happens in the anterior and posterior pituitary? So the pituitary gland is the master endocrine gland. Even though it is controlled by the hypothalamus, the pituitary is the master gland. Now, if you remember, there are 2 parts. Now, the pituitary looks like one structure, but it is 2 glands. The anterior pituitary produces hormones and releases hormones. The posterior pituitary just stores hormones. It stores 2 hormones, oxytocin and ADH. So it stores and releases hormones when it is told to do so by the pituitary. Oh, I skipped number 7. So 7, what is a releasing and an inhibiting factor? So let me back up. The hypothalamus is the one that's monitoring everything, okay? If the hypothalamus detects that the pituitary needs to release a hormone, it sends what's called a releasing factor. And then that tells the pituitary to release the hormone. Now, when the hypothalamus detects that adequate hormone levels are achieved, it sends an inhibiting factor to the pituitary, and then the pituitary stops releasing that hormone. So basically, to understand this, if we initiate the positive feedback, we need a releasing factor to positively add or release hormone. If we want to stop the release of that hormone, we send an inhibiting factor, which is to inhibit or stop release of that hormone. But that's the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So they do work together. If you guys remember in my lectures, I said it's kind of like a corporate structure. The owner of the company, or the CEO, is like the hypothalamus. But quite often, how often do you see the CEO on the floor actually doing things? So the CEO is going to tell like the plant manager, which would be like the pituitary. And so then the pituitary is going to tell the sales department to do this, or, the cleaning staff to do this, or the reception staff to do that, so the pituitary, the plant manager is basically carrying out all the activities, but they're getting direction from the CEO. The CEO is not going to do the work. The CO is just going to sit back and say, hey, do this, do this, do this, do this. And the pituitary is the one running off, doing everything. Okay, for number 9, be able to identify the following hormones and their function. So number 9, these are the hormones that you needed to know, and these are produced in the anterior pituitary. So growth hormone, GH, basically, it helps regulate metabolism and the use of carbohydrates in all cells. Now, growth hormone, obviously, is more active when they're young, but again, to maintain body mass, you need adequate growth hormone to maintain. So obviously it's a little more active as they're growing, and then activity is going to kind of fall off, but you always have to maintain. But it's like, how do you use the proteins, the carbohydrates, to build protein, to build muscle, to build tissue, to maintain body mass? And so growth hormone is going to be needed to maintain tissue, body growth, body development. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, does exactly what it says. It's produced in the anterior pituitary. Its target is the thyroid gland, but it maintains the growth of the thyroid, the growth and development of the thyroid gland, which is in the neck. It also helps regulate release of thyroid hormone in the blood. So to maintain that gland, you need TSH. Follicle stimulating hormone, if you remember, it is named for the female effects, but so it'll be released to initiate or to basically start development of the ovarian follicle. It also has a target in the males to initiate spermatogenesis. So again, it's named for the female effect, but it does have an effect in male and female. Sorry, my paper is really small here. Prolactin actually triggers and maintains lactation. So once animals fertilize, they become pregnant, then close to the end of pregnancy, you start to see the mammary development. Now, prolactin stimulus, as long as an animal is nursing or the teat is stimulated and the mammary tissue is drained, prolactin will still be released and maintain development of the mammary gland. As long as an animal has offspring nursing, that gland will continue to produce milk. Now, ACTH is adrenocorticotropic hormone, named for adrenal gland, cortex tropic growth. ACTH develops and maintains the adrenal gland, or the adrenal cortex, I should say, and also helps regulate the release of adrenal cortex hormones, which is basically cortisol is the primary one. So it maintains that gland, its growth. And then luteinizing hormone, but this basically completes follicle development. So if you remember, I said when the ovarian follicle is stimulated, estrogen is produced, and an oocyte is going to develop into an ovum or a mature egg. And what happens is when that follicle starts to grow, luteinizing hormone goes up. And then when the egg is mature, then luteinizing hormone peaks, and that causes release of the ovum, which causes, remember I said luteinizing, releasing, release the egg, and that's ovulation when an animal can be bred. So I don't know if there's any questions, but you can see that these are primarily targeting those glands and developing those glands, maintaining their growth, and then helping cause the release of those hormones. Now, ADH, what is antidiuretic hormone and when is it released? So ADH is basically antidiuretic. So diuresis is, producing urine or is releasing body water into the urine. Now the hypothalamus is monitoring hydration of the animal, okay? So if the body detects a minor dehydration, ADH is released. Its target is the kidney. Okay, so it's produced. Now, Important about ADH. ADH is produced by the hypothalamus. It is sent to the posterior pituitary for storage. So the posterior pituitary releases ADH. It doesn't make it, it releases it. And it releases it when an animal is dehydrated. Its target is the kidney, and it'll cause the kidney to retain body water, or basically reabsorb body water to hopefully improve hydration. That's the goal of ADH. Now, let me talk about this for a second, because when I had your last test, the urinary test, I talked about what happens if an animal is deficient in ADH. Well, basically, then what happens is body water is released consistently at high levels, and it'll cause, so typically the animal will be polyuric because they're urinating more often because the body isn't regulating how much water it reabsorbs. And then the animal can be polydipsic because they're urinating so often they tend to drink more. And it just reinforces polyuria. So it starts this cycle, but it starts with a polyuria, which drives the polydipsia. How does oxytocin affect the uterus and milk production? So oxytocin is the other hormone that's produced by the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary, but it is released to initiate uterine contractions, and it's going to cause milk letdown. Now, the difference between prolactin and oxytocin. Now prolactin is causing the mammary gland to produce milk and to maintain the gland. Oxytocin, and we talk about this coming up because I do pregnancy and lactation. Basically, high in the gland, there's milk. But we got to move the milk from the higher part of the gland to the teat. It's called milk letdown. So when an animal begins to nurse, oxytocin is released, and that causes the milk to move down where the animal, can do it. And sometimes, women who, I won't get too much into this, but, I nurse 2 kids and you hear your baby cry, and then all of a sudden I could feel the milk move down. It's like, oh, they're ready to eat. So women can feel this as well. It's like you feel your milk come in and the baby's ready to eat. So that's milk letdown. But also primarily it's going to, yes, I agree, Rachel, very strange. It's going to cause that milk to move into the lower gland, but also to initiate uterine contraction. So what the hypothalamus is detecting is the weight of the fetus and also hormone levels so then the hypothalamus knows basically the fetus is developed and ready for birth. And then a releasing factor is sent to the pituitary, oxytocin is released, targets the uterus, and the uterus begins to contract and the babies are delivered. So initiates uterine contraction and milk letdown. Okay, identify the effect of the following hormones. Include the name of the gland and where they are produced. Okay, so the first one is T3 and T4. I said you didn't need to know. You didn't need to know those names, but basically these are the thyroid. They are produced by the thyroid, and they regulate the metabolic rate of all cells. They have a calorigenic effect, so again, they can burn fat. If an animal has a hypermetabolism or hyperthyroid, they're usually very thin and skinny because they're burning calories at a higher rate. Sometimes they have a higher temperature. But again, they are produced in the thyroid. Now, I did not put on your homework list, or you might want to make a note, the other hormone that I wanted you to know that I talked about in lecture was calcitonin. So calcitonin is produced in the thyroid gland too, but calcitonin will help treat hypercalcemia. Basically what happens if there's elevated calcium, the thyroid gland will release calcitonin, and it will take calcium from the blood and move it into the bones, therefore bringing the blood levels to normal. So even though that wasn't on your list, that's another one to know for the test is calcitonin works with hypercalcemia. Now PTH, let me scoot over to the right. I don't know if you have these in the same order I do, but parathyroid hormone is not produced in the thyroid gland. This is a separate gland. They are paired, very, very tiny nodules right next to the thyroid. Now parathyroid glands produce parathyroid hormone. It has the opposite effect on calcium. So it helps maintain blood calcium homeostasis. If you put that on your homework, that's exactly correct. But parathyroid hormone tends to raise blood calcium. So if your blood calcium's too low, parathyroid hormone, its main target is the kidney and the intestine. And what it'll do is it'll tell the kidney to reabsorb calcium instead of sending it to the urine. It'll also tell the intestine to try and absorb more calcium from the diet. In rare or extreme cases, it can pull calcium from the bones, but hopefully you get enough, retained back from the urine and retained from the intestine where it doesn't have to pull from the bones. So calcitonin basically lowers blood calcium and PTH raises blood calcium. So they have an opposite. So again, calcitonin wasn't on your list. You do need to know it for the test. Cortisol. Now, cortisol is produced in the adrenal cortex, and this is the primary hormone of stress. So it will raise blood glucose. It can raise blood pressure. But if you think about it, stress or fight and flight, the body needs to respond. It needs like a boost of sugar. It needs a boost of blood pressure to get blood to the muscle, brain, heart, lungs, to be, ready to evade. So cortisol is the primary hormone produced by the adrenal cortex. One that was not on here that I do want to mention, apologize, is epinephrine is produced by the adrenal medulla. Now it increases your heart rate, increases force of contraction, dilates the bronchioles. And so again, in times of stress, the adrenal gland itself is primarily initiated by the fight and flight system and helps the body respond in times of stress. So if you remember, kind of like the pituitary, the adrenal gland looks like one structure, except it's two glands. The cortex on the outside, the medulla in the middle. And so both produce different hormones, but they respond in almost identical scenarios: stress, fight and flight, increased blood pressure, increased hyperglycemic, boost blood sugar. Aldosterone was one, and this is also produced in the adrenal gland, in the adrenal medulla. And this helps in fight and flight, and it basically deals with our, remember we talked about glucocorticoids, mineral corticoids. So for cellular function, which again, in times of fight and flight and stress, you're accessing and you're, needing high levels of cellular metabolism, and a balance of those electrolytes is key to have normal cell function. Insulin is produced in the pancreas, the endocrine pancreas, not the exocrine, and basically in the islets of the pancreas, but insulin lowers blood glucose. So again, insulin takes glucose from the blood and moves it into the cells. So if an animal is insulin deficient, which is diabetes mellitus, basically what happens is that the insulin is floating in the blood. The glucose is floating in the blood and not making it into the cells. So if an animal needs to get insulin injections because the pancreas isn't making it, it's to keep that blood glucose normal. We don't want it too high. Glucagon has the opposite effect. So glucagon is produced by the endocrine pancreas, but it raises blood glucose. So what glucagon does is, if there's low levels of blood glucose, it will access stored glucose in the liver, in the fat, which is called that glycogenesis or glycogenolysis. It takes glycogen is stored glucose. This is where the names glucagon, glycogen, okay. When glucose is stored, it's called glycogen. If we need to access stored glucose, glucagon will take that and turn it into usable glucose. So basically, that's the glycogenolysis. Break down glycogen to release it as glucose, but it's not stored as glucose. So that's the difference. So I want you to know one lowers blood glucose, one raises blood glucose, both produced by the endocrine pancreas. Estrogen is produced in the ovarian follicle. So in the female, in an intact female, the ovary, when it's stimulated by FSH, a follicle is going to develop. Now, it's interesting. The egg is an oocyte. It's going to grow. And when it's stimulated, estrogen is going to grow with the egg. Now, when the egg is mature and estrogen levels peak, that's when LH peaks and releases the egg. So if you were monitoring, you could monitor luteinizing hormone, but a lot of people monitor estrogen levels. And when estrogen peaks, that's when we know the follicle is mature. The follicle holds the egg, and that's when the egg is ready, and then the animal can be fertilized or become pregnant. Progesterone, if you remember, progesterone, when that follicle ruptures and releases the egg, it seals. Think of it like an empty follicle. And when it seals, it becomes something called a corpus luteum. Now, when an egg is released, the body's going to assume that the animal's going to get fertilized and become pregnant. If the animal becomes pregnant, basically, well, what happens when this seals? It starts producing progesterone. Progesterone is known as the hormone of pregnancy. Now, as long as the animal is pregnant, that corpus luteum will stay formed and continue to produce progesterone. If an animal fails to get pregnant, because this automatically seals and starts producing progesterone, but if there's no pregnancy, or, some people have an intact animal and they don't want to breed them, they just didn't spay them, they're going to release the egg, and then what happens is there's no fertilization, that corpus luteum will shrink and progesterone levels drop. Okay, so really, the only time progesterone levels are maintained is if the animal becomes pregnant. But it is produced initially, and then it starts to kind of fall off from there. The other one I didn't mention on here, which testosterone is the primary sex hormone in the male, which helps helps produce the sperm. So it's testosterone maintains the testicle sperm production, and also like the interstitial cells, and that's the primary sex hormone in the male. The other one that wasn't on this list, as I told you, is prostaglandins. Now, prostaglandins are tissue hormones. They are not produced by like a specific organ. They are kind of produced and have their effects on many organs, but like maintain, usually initiated when there's tissue injury and moderate inflammation. And then the last hormone on here, which is question 13, which is my favorite to talk about, is why is erythropoietin so essential? What happens if an animal cannot produce this hormone? So erythro, red, poiesis, production of. So this hormone initiates red blood cell production. Now, what do I need to understand is erythropoietin is produced by the kidneys. Okay, so let me give you a scenario. And I'm sorry, I have an anemic cat right now, so I'm kind of dealing with this real time. When I first discovered that my cat was anemic, now he's maybe 12, 14 years old, my first thought was like, oh gosh, you're going into kidney failure because you're just an old cat and that's what cats do. His kidney values were normal. So I was like, oh, okay. Because what happens is red blood cells die. They don't live forever. Okay, so what's happening is red blood cells, follow me, carry oxygen. The body, the hypothalamus is monitoring oxygen levels in the blood. when the body detects hypoxemia, which is low oxygen in the blood, now not enough where the animal's gasping for air, but minimal levels of hypoxemia, the hypothalamus is going to send a releasing factor to the kidney. The kidney is going to release erythropoietin. Now, erythropoietin's target is the bone marrow. So what it does in normal animals is it will signal the bone marrow to release more red blood cells. Now, when more red blood cells are released, oxygen levels rise. Hypothalamus says we're good. Inhibiting factor tells the kidney stop releasing erythropoietin, and everything goes back to normal. And then when levels drop again, this happens. You worry, what I worry, if an animal's in renal failure, then they cannot basically, if they cannot produce erythropoietin, what happens is a lot of times those renal failure cats are anemic. And it's not because they're losing red blood cells. I mean, red blood cells are dying like normal. The body's just not reproducing them. And you either have to do a blood transfusion or you can give a synthetic form of erythropoietin and try to get the bone marrow to respond. So a lot of times it's not the bone marrow's fault. You can have a beautiful bone marrow, but it just has to be told what to do. Okay. So I want you to understand that whole concept is like, what's the stimulus? The body is not there counting red blood cells, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's not monitoring how many red blood cells. Okay. There's not like a counter sitting there going tick, 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 tick. It's monitoring oxygen levels, because if you have enough red blood cells, your oxygen should be normal, theoretically. And that's what we're looking for. Now, I can tell you on a side note, just because we're talking about this, my current cat, we think has what's called hemolytic anemia, potentially autoimmune hemolytic anemia, because the kidneys are normal. So erythropoietin should be fine, but we think the immune system, for some reason, is killing off his red blood cells too fast. Now, he was showing, since you guys are talking about this in ClinLab 1, I'm assuming, he is showing signs of regeneration. He has reticulocytes, he had anisocytosis, polychromasia. He has all the signs that the bone marrow is trying to respond. The only side note, and not to add on a side story, is that my cat is also losing massive amounts of weight, and he's becoming icteric. So the other thing is, because the hemolysis is so great, you remember when I said we did this in the digestive system, when you have icterus, which is the yellowing of the mucous membranes, his serum is icteric. It's not necessarily his liver's fault, but the problem is the liver is processing so many dead red blood cells, it can't keep up. And so the cause for my cat's icterus is the hemolytic anemia. So you can, I'm kind of putting together 2 or 3 things with an actual case, but the other problem my cat has is he's continuing to lose weight. He's continuing to become constipated, and he's losing muscle at a crazy amount. So we think he probably has cancer somewhere, either in his bone marrow, his intestine. I'm not pursuing testing to try and find the cancer. I probably, unfortunately, this weekend or so have to euthanize him, because I know that he's losing red blood cells. Even if I give him a blood transfusion, it's not gonna, it'll maybe boost his red blood cells, but hemolytic anemia doesn't cause the amount of weight loss that he's experiencing typically. So there's something else potentially going on that needs further testing, but I'm probably not going to do chemo or treat him, so why put him through the testing? So unfortunately, since I know I've been talking about my cat, it's been a complicated case, but he's not doing well. So I'm doing sub-Q fluids, canned foods, tuna. The cat gets anything he wants. He's very weak. I'm just keeping him comfortable for a few more days, and appetite stimulants, anti-nausea meds, sub-Q fluids. So yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't want to end on a sad note, but I figured I probably should update. Yeah, so I know a few of you guys have been either on kennel or probably saw me. I had to come in Sunday because he got constipated again really bad, and he kind of started open mouth breathing during his enema, and I was like, okay, I'm not killing you over an enema, like, but he goes through these periods of dehydration and can't poop, and yes, so I kind of got desperate because he got weak, and then I ended up going into, during snowstorm, I ended up going into the ER BCA where I used to work because he just really, from Sunday to Monday, he wasn't even moving. He was like laying in one spot, barely licked food. And that's where the doctor that I used to work with, she was like, Christine, it's not good. And I said, okay. In my heart, I knew it. So I gave him, he did Serenia for nausea. I'm doing mirtazapine for an appetite stimulant. I have sub-Q fluids. But now, like from yesterday and today, he's eating, he's purring, but he's losing weight. So I know I'm kind of not winning, but he is a little more comfortable. He is eating. Like I said, I got tuna, so I'm giving him tuna. I'm giving him whatever. I don't care. He can eat what he wants, everything. So thank you guys if you've helped me, if you've listened to me. If I'm a wreck later, you know why. So if he does better, I might not do it this weekend. He's actually had a couple good days. So, but cats do this. I think, Monday I thought, oh my gosh, he was dying in front of me. And now he's had like a couple good days. So sometimes this is the hard part of our job, is sometimes when is it time? And, I think it's not quite time. It's close, but not, we're going to still do our little bits of food, and I sit with him and feed him, and he eats in my lap, and I give him sub-Q fluids in my lap. And so anyway, sorry for the downer information, but it's interesting. In my cat, a couple of things that I've lectured you about are actually happening. So I always feel like, well, here's the real world application of icteric cat, anemic. So, okay. Do you have any other questions about the endocrine system? Let me get back to, hopefully, and I know that the endocrine system is kind of complex, but hopefully you're seeing, you've got the pituitary side, you've got the target, it's what I call satellite glands in the body. So, again, there's hormones that are produced in the pituitary, and then there's hormones that are produced by the glands in the body. So make sure you know which hormones are produced where, what is the stimulus for them to be released. Like, they're all, remember, they're a messenger. What is the message? In erythropoietin, the message is like, we need oxygen. We need red blood cells. In thyroid, it's like, we need metabolism. With insulin, it's like, get rid of this glucose. There's always a cause and effect. So we're monitoring something because we need something to happen. So if you approach it studying from that perspective, maybe it will make sense. So the test will open here at, what did I say, 2:45? I can probably change it to like 2:30. But you'll have plenty of time. If you have problems, email or text me if you're having computer problems. If not, I'll see you same time tomorrow, and we will start the reproductive, and I'll get your scores. I'll try and get all that caught up. Any other questions? Do you need anything?